Good evening, and welcome to Renton Civic Theater presents Scary Stories to be Told in the Dark. Tonight's first episode, number 13, by M.R. James. Is there a reason that hotels never use the number 13? After this story, you might never ask that question again.
Number 13, by M.R. James. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near it is Hold, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by its finder-up, where Marsk Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull, where his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Preisler's and the Phoenix are all that can be desired. But my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his absentation. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Songjungkirk, the Radhus, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front of it is brick, with corbis steps on the gables and a text over the door. But the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white cage work in wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in Rigsarkiv Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and, after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms, and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required. But on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms, which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favor of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbors, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast-iron erection on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription, I Bog Mose, Cap 22, above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old colored print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines. the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfeuer, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tail of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed half a dozen times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with any clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me, I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper, and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, and which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his great-coat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining-room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and, as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So at least he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his wanton 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. But probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily upon the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Anderson attacked the Rigsark Kiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jürgen Fries, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block for the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practiced secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church that such a viper and blood-sucking trolldmund should be patronized and harbored by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Nicholas Franken, if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Anderson had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day. But he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decision of bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not, and could not be, a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Anderson was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and, as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Anderson had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Anderson spoke of embodying their contents. "This house of the Bishop Freeze," he added, "it is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlucky of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greater part in the archive. Just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind, perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him." After taking some exercise, I forgot exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door, with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside of it, for as he neared the door, he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick, hissing breathing, as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he had selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket-handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stupige must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait until the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall, no passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the window-sill, looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man, or was it by any chance a woman? At least, it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and, he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white material on the window-sill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the window-sill and went to bed. Next morning he was woke by the stupige with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed, and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it possibly have escaped him the night before? He did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice, after all, had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed. And here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast, rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots still outside his door, a gentleman's boots. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man. So he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found, which referred to the affair of Mag Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jürgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared, if need be, to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Mag Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the apostle and evangelist St. John in his heavenly apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you," etc. Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon, he paid a short visit to Hald, and took his tea at Bakeland, nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain in his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper, he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why, in most of the hotels one visits in this country, The number 13 is left out of the list of rooms. I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing like that! I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the High School of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years, a fine upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys one snowy day—" Here he plunged into reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13? Said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Aarhus first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house." Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. "And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travelers, are what we have to provide for in general, and put them in number 13? Why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them. But they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another." The landlord, after searching for a more graphic phrase. "Then what do you use your number 13 for?" said Anderson, conscious as he said the words of a curious anxiety, quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. "My number 13? Why, don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room." "Well, yes, only I happened to think, that is, I fancied last night that I had seen a door number 13 in that passage, and really, I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it in the night before as well." Of course, Herr Christensen laughed this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had existed before him in that hotel. Anderson was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficient good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation, and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he went to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room where he entered it, but there was nothing beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind, and sat down to his writing. His neighbors were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage, and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordering in whiskey and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a tired man who had little at meals, being generally engaged in study, a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Stagfeuer Herr Anders Jensen, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in a hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style, and Andersen's thoughts, like those of Emily in the Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them, but when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor, and even if my neighbors swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I'm acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it was probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Andersen had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Andersen's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with a despairing moan, as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Andersen felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge and society to some neighbor bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Andersen. "He must be. And what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business, by what I hear, and a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered, without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer. In dishabille and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull, it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind? Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Andersen to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the next room to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Andersen eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen, rather sharply. "At least, not this morning." "Ah!" said Andersen. "Nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was silence. "Come," said the lawyer. "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heaven," said Christensen. How should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Andersen thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, Omnis Spiritus Laudet Dominum. He could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Andersen. "The three of us. Shall we go and investigate the next room?" "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defense that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Andersen and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Andersen remained outside, looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door, and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Andersen, with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so has mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Andersen. His back was now to the door. In that moment, the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Andersen was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust and fright, when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Andersen hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them to the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought, and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Andersen hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5-1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop!" said Andersen. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Andersen looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Andersen glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight? A double-bedded one?" Neither Jensen nor Andersen was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, the portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Mag Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find, lying between the beams which supported the flooring, was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document, with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebald Behem, representing a number of sages seated around a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the 2, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Southinius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Southinius, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. "How did he know what company he was courting?" And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him.
Tonight's second episode, The Ebony Frame, by Edith Nesbit. A haunting and creepy ghost story with something to say about turning romance into an idol.
The Ebony Frame, by Edith Nesbit, written 1924. To be rich is a luxurious sensation. The more so when you have plumbed the depths of hard-upness as a Fleet Street hack, a picker-up of unconsidered pars, a reporter, an unappreciated journalist, all callings utterly inconsistent with one's family feeling and one's direct descent from the Dukes of Picardy. When my Aunt Dorcas died and left me $700 a year and a furnished house in Chelsea, I felt that life had nothing left to offer except immediate possession of the legacy. Even Mildred Mayhew, whom I had hitherto regarded as my life's light, became less luminous. I was not engaged to Mildred, but I lodged with her mother, and I sang duets with Mildred, and gave her gloves when it would run to it, which was seldom. She was a dear good girl, and I meant to marry her some day. It's very nice to feel that a good little woman is thinking of you. It helps you in your work, and it is pleasant to know she will say yes when you say, "Will you?" But as I say, my legacy almost put Mildred out of my head, especially as she was staying with friends in the country just then. Before the first gloss was off my new mourning, I was seated in my aunt's own armchair in front of the fire in the dining room of my own house. My own house! It was grand, but rather lonely. I did think of Mildred just then. The room was comfortably furnished with oak and leather. On the walls hung a few fairly good oil paintings, but the space above the mantelpiece was disfigured by an exceedingly bad print. The Trial of Lord William Russell, framed in a dark frame. I got up to look at it. I had visited my aunt with dutiful regularity, but I never remember seeing this frame before. It was not intended for a print, but for an oil painting. It was of fine ebony, beautifully and curiously carved. I looked at it with growing interest, and when my aunt's housemaid, I had retained her modest staff of servants, came in with the lamp, I asked her how long the print had been there. "Mistress only bought it 2 days afore she took ill," she said. "But the frame, she didn't want to buy a new one, so she got this out of the attic. There's lots of curious old things there, sir." Had my aunt had this frame long? "Oh, yes, sir. It come long afore I did, and I've been here 7 years come Christmas. There was a picture in it. That's upstairs too, but it's that black and ugly, it might as well be chimney back." I felt a desire to see this picture. What if it were some priceless old master in which my aunt's eyes had only seen rubbish? Directly after breakfast the next morning, I paid a visit to the lumber room. It was crammed with old furniture, enough to stock a curiosity shop. All the house was furnished solidly in the early Victorian style, and in this room everything not in keeping with drawing-room suite ideal was stowed away. Tables of papier-mâché and mother-of-pearl, straight-back chairs with twisted feet and faded needlework cushions, fire screens of old-world design, an oak bureau with brass handles, a little work table with its faded, moth-eaten silk flutings hanging in disconsolate shreds. On these and the dust that covered them blazed the full daylight as I drew up the blinds. I promised myself a good time re-enshrining these household gods in my parlor and promoting the Victorian suite to the attic. But at present my business was to find the picture as black as the chimney back, and presently, behind a heap of hideous still life studies, I found it. Jane, the housemaid, identified it at once. I took it downstairs, carefully, and examined it. No subject, no color were distinguishable. There was a splodge of darker tint in the middle, but whether it was a figure or a tree or a house, no man could have told. It seemed to be painted on a very thick panel bound with leather. I decided to send it to one of those persons who pour on rotting family portraits the water of eternal youth. Mere soap and water, Mr. Besant tells us it is. But even as I did so, the thought occurred to me to try my own restorative hand at a corner of it. My bath sponge, soap, and nail brush, vigorously applied for a few seconds, showed me that there was no picture to clean. Bare oak presented itself to my persevering brush. I tried the other side, Jane watching me with indulgent interest. The same result. Then the truth dawned on me. Why was the panel so thick? I tore off the leather binding, and the panel divided and fell to the ground in a cloud of dust. There were 2 pictures. They had been nailed face to face. I leaned them against the wall, and the next moment I was leaning against it myself, for one of the pictures was myself, a perfect portrait, no shade of expression or turn of feature wanting, myself, in a cavalier dress, love locks and all. When had this been done, and how, without my knowledge, was this some whim of my aunt's? "Lor, sir!" the shrill surprise of Jane at my elbow. "What a lovely photo it is! Was it a fancy ball, sir?" "Yes," I stammered. I don't think I want anything more now. You can go." She went, and I turned, still with my heart beating violently, to the other picture. This was a woman of the type of beauty beloved of Burne-Jones and Rossetti. Straight nose, low brows, and full lips, thin hands, large, deep, luminous eyes. She wore a black velvet gown. It was a full-length portrait. Her arms rested on a table beside her, and her head on her hands, but her face was turned full forward, and her eyes met those of the spectator bewilderingly. On the table by her were compasses and instruments whose uses I did not know, books, a goblet, and a miscellaneous heap of papers and pens. I saw all this afterwards. I believe it was a quarter of an hour before I could turn my eyes away from hers. I've never seen any other eyes like hers. They appealed as a child's or a dog's do. They commanded as might those of an empress. "Shall I sweep the dust, sir?" Curiosity had brought Jane back. I acceded. I turned from her my portrait. I kept between her and the woman in the black velvet. When I was alone again, I tore down The Trial of Lord William Russell, and I put the picture of the woman in its strong ebony frame. Then I wrote to a frame maker for a frame for my portrait. It had so long lived face to face with this beautiful witch that I had not the heart to banish it from her presence, from which it will be perceived that I am by nature a somewhat sentimental person. The new frame came home, and I hung it opposite the fireplace. An exhaustive search among my aunt's papers showed no explanation of the portrait of myself, nor history of the portrait of the woman with the wonderful eyes. I only learned that all the old furniture together had come to my aunt at the death of my great-uncle, the head of the family, and I should have concluded that the resemblance was only a family one, if everyone who came had not exclaimed at the speaking likeness. I adopted Jane's fancy ball explanation. And there, one might suppose, the matter of the portraits ended. One might suppose it, that is, if there were not evidently a good deal more written about it here. However, to me, then, the matter seemed ended. I went to see Mildred. I invited her and her mother to come and stay with me. I rather avoided glancing at the picture in the ebony frame. I could not forget it, nor remember without singular emotion the look in the eyes of that woman when mine first met them. I shrank from meeting that look again. I reorganized the house somewhat, preparing for Mildred's visit. I turned the dining room into a drawing room. I brought down much of the old-fashioned furniture, and, after a long day of arranging and rearranging, I sat down before the fire, and, lying back in a pleasant languor, I idly raised my eyes to the picture. I met her dark, deep hazel eyes, and once more my gaze was held fixed as by a strong magic. The kind of fascination that keeps one sometimes staring for whole minutes into one's own eyes with a glass. I gazed into her eyes and felt my own dilate, pricked with a smart like the smart of tears. "I wish," I said, "oh, how I wish you were a woman and not a picture. Come down. Oh, come down." I laughed at myself as I spoke, but even as I laughed, I held out my arms. I was not sleepy, I was not drunk. I was as wide awake and as sober as ever was a man in this world. And yet, as I held out my arms, I saw the eyes of the picture dilate, her lips tremble. If I were to be hanged for saying it, it is true. Her hands moved slightly, and a sort of flicker of a smile passed over her face. I sprang to my feet. "This won't do," I said aloud. "Firelight does play strange tricks. I'll have the lamp." I pulled myself together and made for the bell. My hand was on it when I heard a sound behind me and turned, the bell still unrung. The fire had burned low, and the corners of the room were deeply shadowed, but surely there, behind the tall worked chair, was something darker than a shadow. "I must face this out," I said, "or I shall never be able to face myself again." I left the bell. I seized the poker and battered the dull coals to a blaze. Then I stepped back resolutely and looked up at the picture. The ebony frame was empty. From the shadow of the worked chair came a silken rustle, and out of the shadow the woman of the picture was coming towards me. I hope I shall never again know a moment of terror so blank and absolute. I could not have moved or spoken to save my life. Either all the known laws of nature were nothing, or I was mad. I stood trembling, but I am thankful to remember I stood still, while the black velvet gown swept across the hearthrug toward me. Next moment a hand touched me, a hand soft, warm, and human, and a low voice said, "You called me. I'm here." At that touch and that voice, the world seemed to give a sort of bewildering half-turn. I hardly know how to express it, but at once it seemed not awful, not even unusual for portraits to become flesh, only most natural, most right, most unspeakably fortunate. I laid my hand on hers. I looked from her to my portrait. I could not see it in the firelight. "We are not strangers," I said. "Oh, no, not strangers." Those luminous eyes were looking up into mine. Those red lips were near me. With a passionate cry and a sense of having suddenly recovered life's one great good that had seemed wholly lost, I clasped her in my arms. She was no ghost. She was a woman, the only woman in the world. "How long?" I said. "Oh, love, how long since I lost you?" She leaned back, hanging her full weight on the hands that were clasped behind my head. "How can I tell how long? There is no time in hell. she answered. It was not a dream. Ah, no. There are no such dreams. I wish to God there could be. When in dreams do I see her eyes, hear her voice, feel her lips against my cheek, hold her hands to my lips, as I did that night, the supreme night of my life. At first we hardly spoke. It seemed enough. After long grief and pain, to feel the arms of my true love round me once again. It is very difficult to tell this story. There are no words to express the sense of glad reunion, the complete realization of every hope and dream of a life that came upon me as I sat with my hand in hers and looked into her eyes. How could it have been a dream? When I left her sitting in the straight-backed chair and went down to the kitchen to tell the maids I should want nothing more, that I was busy and did not wish to be disturbed. When I fetched wood for the fire with my own hands and, bringing it in, found her still sitting there, saw the little brown head turn as I entered, saw the love in her dear eyes, when I threw myself at her feet and blessed the day I was born, since life had given me this? Not a thought of Mildred. All the other things in my life were a dream, this its one splendid reality. I am wondering, she said after a while, when we had made such cheer of each other as true lovers may after long parting, I'm wondering how much you remember of our past. I remember nothing, I said. Oh, my dear lady, my dear sweetheart, I remember nothing but that I love you, that I have loved you all my life. You remember nothing? Really nothing? Only that I'm yours, that we have both suffered, that... Tell me, my mistress dear, all that you remember. Explain it all to me. Make me understand. And yet, no, I don't want to understand. It is enough that we are together. If it was a dream, why have I never dreamed it again? She leaned down towards me, her arm lay on my neck, and drew my head till it rested on her shoulder. I am a ghost, I suppose, she said, laughing softly, and her laughter stirred memories which I just grasped at and just missed. But you and I know better, don't we? I will tell you everything you have forgotten. We loved each other. Ah, no, you haven't forgotten that. And when you came back from the war, we were to be married. Our pictures were painted before you went away. You know I was more learned than women of that day. Dear one, when you were gone, they said I was a witch. They tried me. They said I should be burned, just because I'd looked at the stars and had gained more knowledge than they. They must needs bind me to a stake and let me be eaten by the fire, and you far away. Her whole body trembled and shrank. Oh, love, what dream would have told me that my kisses would soothe even that memory? The night before, she went on, the devil did come to me. I was innocent before, you know it, don't you? And even then my sin was for you, because of the exceeding love I bore you. The devil came, and I sold my soul to eternal flame. But I got a good price. I got the right to come back, through my picture, if anyone looking at it wished for me, as long as my picture stayed in its ebony frame. That frame was not carved by man's hand. I got the right to come back to you. Oh, my heart's heart, and another thing I won, which you shall hear anon. They burned me for a witch. They made me suffer hell on earth. Those faces, all crowding round, the crackling wood and the smell of smoke. Oh, love, no more, no more. When my mother sat that night before my picture, she wept and cried, Come back, my poor lost child. And I went to her with glad leaps of heart. Dear, she shrank from me, she fled, she shrieked and moaned of ghosts. She had our pictures covered from sight and put again in the ebony frame. She'd promised me my picture should stay always there. Ah, through all these years your face was against mine. She paused. But the man you loved? You came home. My picture was gone. They lied to you, and you married another woman. But someday I knew you would walk the world again, and that I should find you. The other gain, I asked. The other gain, she said slowly, I gave my soul for. It is this. If you also will give up your hopes of heaven, I can remain a woman. I can move in your world. I can be your wife. Oh, my dear, after all these years, at last, at last. If I sacrifice my soul, I said slowly, with no thought of the imbecility of such talk in our so-called 19th century. If I sacrifice my soul, I win you. Why, love, it's a contradiction in terms. You are my soul. Her eyes looked straight into mine. Whatever might happen, whatever did happen, whatever may happen, our two souls in that moment met and became one. Then you choose. You deliberately choose to give up your hopes of heaven for me as I give up mine for you. I decline, I said, to give up my hope of heaven on any terms. Tell me what I must do that you and I may make our heaven here as now, my dear love. I will tell you tomorrow, she said. Be alone here tomorrow night. 12 is ghosts' time, isn't it? And then I will come out of the picture and never go back to it. I shall live with you and die and be buried, and there will be an end to me. But we shall live first, my heart's heart. I laid my head on her knee. A strange drowsiness overcame me. Holding her hand against my cheek, I lost consciousness. When I awoke, the gray November dawn was glimmering, ghost-like, through the uncurtained window. My head was pillowed on my arm, which rested, as I raised my head quickly, not on my lady's knee, but on the needleworked cushion of the straight-backed chair. I sprang to my feet. I was stiff with cold and dazed with dreams, but I turned my eyes on the picture. There she sat, my lady, my dear love. I held out my arms, but the passionate cry I would have uttered died on my lips. She had said 12 o'clock. Her lightest word was my law. So I only stood in front of the picture and gazed into those gray-green eyes till tears of passionate happiness filled my own. Oh, my dear, how shall I pass the hours till I hold you again? No thought then of my whole life's completion and consummation being a dream. I staggered up to my room, fell across my bed, and slept heavily and dreamlessly. When I awoke, it was high noon. Mildred and her mother were coming to lunch. I remembered at one shock Mildred's coming and her existence. Now indeed the dream began. With a penetrating sense of the futility of any action apart from her, I gave the necessary orders for the reception of my guests. When Mildred and her mother came, I received them with cordiality, but my genial phrases all seemed to be someone else's. My voice sounded like an echo. My heart was otherwhere. Still, the situation was not intolerable until the hour when afternoon tea was served in the drawing-room. Mildred and her mother kept the conversation pot boiling with a profusion of genteel commonplaces, and I bore it, as one can bear mild purgatories when one is in sight of heaven. I looked up at my sweetheart in the ebony frame, and I felt that anything that might happen, any irresponsible imbecility, any bathos of boredom, was nothing if, after it all, she came to me again. And yet, when Mildred, too, looked at the portrait and said, "What a fine lady! One of your flames, Mr. Devine?" I had a sickening sense of impotent irritation, which became absolute torture when Mildred, how could I ever have admired that chocolate box barmaid style of prettiness, threw herself into the high-backed chair, covering the needlework with her ridiculous flounces, and added, "Silence gives consent. Who is it, Mr. Devine? Tell us all about her. I am sure she has a story." Poor little Mildred, sitting there smiling, serene in her confidence that her every word charmed me, sitting there with her rather pinched waist, her rather tight boots, her rather vulgar voice, sitting in the chair where my dear lady had sat when she told me her story. I could not bear it. "Don't sit there," I said. "It's not comfortable." But the girl would not be warned. With a laugh, she set every nerve in my body vibrating with an annoyance. She said, "Oh dear, mustn't I even sit in the same chair as your black velvet woman?" I looked at the chair in the picture. It was the same, and in her chair Mildred was sitting. Then a horrible sense of the reality of Mildred came upon me. Was all this a reality after all? But for fortunate chance might Mildred have occupied not only her chair, but her place in my life? I rose. "I hope you won't think me very rude," I said, "but I'm obliged to go out." I forget what appointment I alleged. The lie came readily enough. I faced Mildred's pouts with the hope that she and her mother wouldn't wait dinner for me. I fled. In another minute I was safe, alone, under the chill, cloudy autumn sky, free to think. Think of my dear lady. I walked for hours along streets and squares. I lived over again and again every look, word, and hand touch, every kiss. I was completely, unspeakably happy. Mildred was utterly forgotten. My lady of the ebony frame filled my heart and soul and spirit. As I heard 11 boom through the fog, I turned and went home. When I got to my street, I found a crowd surging through it, a strong red light filling the air. A house was on fire. Mine! I elbowed my way through the crowd, the picture of my lady, that at least I could save. As I sprang up the steps, I saw, as in a dream, yes, all this was really dreamlike. I saw Mildred leaning out of the first-floor window, wringing her hands. "Come back, sir," cried a fireman. "We'll get the young lady out right enough." But my lady! I went up the stairs, cracking, smoking, and as hot as hell, to the room where her picture was. Strange to say, I only felt that the picture was a thing we should like to look on through the long, glad, wedded life that was to be ours. I never thought of it as being one with her. As I reached the first floor, I felt arms around my neck. The smoke was too thick for me to distinguish features. "Save me," a voice whispered. I clasped a figure in my arms, and with a strange dis-ease, bore it down the shaking stairs and out into safety. It was Mildred. I knew that directly as I clasped her. "Stand back," cried the crowd. "Everyone's safe," cried a fireman. The flames leaped from every window. The sky grew redder and redder. I sprang from the hands that would have held me. I leaped up the steps. I crawled up the stairs. Suddenly, the whole horror of the situation came to me. As long as my picture remains in the ebony frame. What if picture and frame perished together? I fought with the fire, and with my own choking inability to fight with it, I pushed on. I must save my picture. I reached the drawing room. As I sprang in, I saw my lady, I swear it, through the smoke and the flames, hold out her arms to me, who came too late to save her, and to save my own life's joy. I never saw her again. Before I could reach her or cry out to her, I felt the floor yield beneath my feet, and I fell into the fiery hell below. How did they save me? What does that matter? They saved me somehow, curse them. Every stick of my aunt's furniture was destroyed. My friends pointed out that, as the furniture was heavily insured, the carelessness of a nightly studious housemaid had done me no harm. No harm! That was how I won and lost my only love. I deny with all my soul in the denial that it was a dream. There are no such dreams. Dreams of longing and pain there are in plenty, but dreams of complete, of unspeakable happiness, no. It is the rest of life that is the dream. But if I think that, why have I married Mildred and grown stout and dull and prosperous? I tell you, it is all this that is the dream. My dear lady only is the reality. And what does it matter what one does in a dream?
Thank you for joining us for tonight's performance of Number 13 by M.R. James, read by Matthew Posner, and The Ebony Frame, read by Devin Hamilton. Join us again at the same time tomorrow night for 2 more scary stories to be told in the dark.